Let's take a look at a fairly recent critique of utilitarianism that centers around integrity, due to Bernard Williams. For Williams, act-consequentialist moral theories appear to fail to capture the value of integrity. To show this, Williams constructs two examples. In one, George has a PhD in chemistry and is struggling to find a job that he needs to support his family. A friend of his tells him that he can get him a job at a lab that researches chemical and biological warfare. Also, if George were to refuse the job, it would go to another person that is intent on working very hard. George is opposed to chemical and biological warfare. What should he do? In the other example, Jim is facing 20 captured Indians. A man explains to him that after recent acts of protest against the government, the Indians are just about to be killed to remind other possible protesters of the advantages of not protesting. However, since Jim is an honored guest, he will get the privilege to shoot and kill an Indian himself. If he does, the others will be set free. If he refuses, all 20 will die. Jim is surrounded by soldiers, and the Indians are begging him to take the grotesque deal. He has to take a decision. What should he do? Williams's point is that in the first example, it appears that a consequentialist should fairly obviously answer that George should take the job, since the consequences of not taking the job, the fact that someone will be helping produce chemical weapons anyway, would be the same, if not worse, if he were to refuse the position. In any case, chemical weapons are going to be researched, so from a consequentialist view, he might as well take the job. The consequences in the end are the same, if not slightly better if he accepts. The crux of the matter is that if he was to refuse the job, demonstrating integrity, the consequentialist framework would not account for his integrity. The second example showcases a similar point. If Jim chooses not to shoot and kill the Indian out of principle, that he will not put up with the horrendous deal he is offered, all 20 Indians will die, and the consequentialist calculations will leave no trace of the integrity displayed by Jim. In short, consequentialist moral theories may be flawed, since they appear to not care at all about the integrity of agents. Let us now give a possible rebuttal to the questions raised by Williams by going in order. First, let's take the example of George. And let's explicitly assume that the kind of work he is being offered would produce negative utility. Let's also grant that if he refuses the position, he will certainly be replaced immediately. We will argue that, if George refuses the job, there are important second-order effects that haven't been included in the utilitarian calculations considered by Williams. Firstly, one could argue that another factor to consider is that George would be harming himself psychologically by taking the job. Even if he thinks that accepting the position leads to the best consequences, he would still, probably often, wonder if his talents would not be better spent elsewhere. Maybe in some job where he feels he is actually useful, where he can work hard with passion and enjoyment. But let us leave out this psychological factor to consider another, that we believe is even more crucial. If George refuses the job, he is signaling to his friend, to the human resources of the chemical lab, and to a number of other people, like his family members, that he believes that doing the job is not a good action. In turn, these people might spread the word to other people, who would in turn talk to others, and so on and so forth. George is ever so slightly diluting the pool of candidates for the job, and ever so slightly increasing the positive societal forces that want the negative utility job to be outlawed. In other words, he is eroding the societal rule that allows the job to exist in the first place. These types of consequences might at first glance seem far-fetched or negligible, but one has to also consider the huge utility that societal norms govern. When a negative societal rule is updated to a positive one, or vice versa, the change can last for thousands of years, and the norm impacts the life of an incredible amount of people. The change from a social norm to another is not a simple process, and often it is based on many actions of individuals that start questioning the norm and proposing something else. If nobody were to speak up about wanting to change a societal norm, it would remain the same. Societal norms are sticky, they require some amount of effort to change. Yes, undoubtedly through his actions, one contributes only a fraction to the huge positive utility brought by the change of a societal norm. But it would also seem blindingly naive by a utilitarian to consider any action that attempts to elicit some change in the overarching societal structure as having negligible consequences. So ultimately, the value of integrity is not lost in a consequentialist framework, as it is not lost in the case of George's refusal, since as a consequence of his action, he would be eroding a bad societal norm. Integrity can often be the basis for changes to start taking place. For the second example, we can respond in a similar manner. As before, let's skip the trauma that Jim would endure by killing a person, even if he thought it was the right course of action. If Jim were to refuse the horrific deal, there would still be some value in his stance. He would be strongly signaling to the military that he believes that what they are doing is wrong. In turn, the news of his refusal would have a chance to travel large and wide. Whether the value of the second-order effects created by Jim having integrity is greater than the suffering he would produce to the Indians who are going to die is an interesting question that we will shortly discuss, but it has no bearing on whether consequentialist theories have no place for integrity. In his writings, Bernard Williams does not completely ignore these kinds of second-order effects that we have been discussing, but he focuses only on a facet of them that is sometimes called the precedent effect. He describes this effect as that one morally can psychologically be influenced to do what someone has actually done, but he then dismisses it almost entirely. In the present examples, however, it is very implausible to think that the precedent effect could be invoked to make any difference to the calculation. Jim's case is extraordinary enough, and it is hard to imagine who the recipients of the effect might be supposed to be. While George is not in a sufficiently public situation or role for the question to arise in that form. And in any case, one might suppose that the motivations of others on such an issue were quite likely to be fixed one way or another already. No appeal then to these other effects is going to make a difference to what the utilitarian will decide about our examples. Maybe this dismissal is motivated by the fact that the effect in question is defined in a narrow way with respect to all the second-order effects the actions of Jim and George could produce by taking a stand. Taking a more broad overview of the whole scope of the possible second-order effects, it is hard to deny that some acts of integrity have had far-reaching consequences that may have even influenced our history. Take the defiant refusal of Rosa Parks to give her seat to a white man who requested it on a bus, an act that led to her arrest. Did her integrity and its subsequent depiction by others not in part lead to an erosion of the societal norms perpetuating segregation? What about the act of the Buddhist monk Kwan Duc, who immolated himself to protest the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government? Did his act not in part contribute to the concessions that the South Vietnamese government swiftly agreed to with the Buddhist leadership? In the case of Kwan Duc, we can observe the second-order effects of actions in full force, so they appear more evident. But what about even all the small acts of integrity we make every day, for instance recycling? We all know that it is not our individual efforts in recycling that will make a concrete difference in the levels of global pollution. But adopting such a societal rule constantly reminds us and others the importance of taking care of our planet. These signals, even if they don't have the magnitude of the dramatic suicide of Kwan Duc, spread through our society and permeate our culture. They must be then accounted for in consequentialist calculations if they contribute to determine, even if indirectly, the outcomes of matters of such importance. While it is true that integrity is not the be-all end-all of morality for our utilitarian, it is not unvalued. It has significant importance and is something to consider carefully. Given a personal take on the examples of George and Jim, one might suspect, for what it is worth, that in the case of George, his integrity would quite comfortably tilt the philosophic calculus to the positive side. He can also likely find a paying job where he can be useful in short time. Instead, in the case of Jim, taking a stand might not be worth it. Because, to keep it brief, it appears that Jim can accept the deal, saving 19 Indians, and still be able to subsequently leverage, if he wanted to, most if not all the outrage the horrendous event would cause to try to put an end to such practices anyway. To conclude, integrity does not have the ultimate say in moral decisions, but it remains a very important component to consider in consequentialist frameworks when evaluating the morality of actions. Lots of eudaimonia to all.